How's it going, you guys? Welcome to a new landscape photography vlog. Well, not really a landscape photography vlog because I'm back in New York City here for a Sony event. Got Mike and Andy right here, two other talented photographers. And yeah, last year I was here shooting a lot of abstract photography, textures, patterns, just trying to be a little bit more creative and see what I could come up with. And that's really the goal of this trip as well, like see if we can get a bit more creative. And I really want to expand upon that series. But the benefit of walking around a city like this, or really anywhere where you can take photos, is you never know what you're going to run into. And that was the case last year when I was in Times Square and I found that crazy puddle with all the colors to shoot. So I'm really hoping we can get some of that for this trip. I want some surprises.
After walking around for a little bit, I looked towards the tops of the buildings and I found a few of my first compositions.
For this shoot, I'm staying pretty portable right now. I got the Sony A1, and then I have the 28 to 200 millimeter, the Tamron, because it's really nice to be able to switch from a wide angle perspective to a telephoto perspective really, really fast. Especially if you're seeing a fleeting moment, like birds are flying past a building or something like that, being able to have a lens that kind of does it all is really nice. So I'm gonna stick with this one, kind of look around here for the different areas where the light meets the shadows, look for different shapes in the windows, and yeah, we'll just see what we can find.
One of my favorite ways to create minimalism out of these scenes is to zoom in out in the distance with a telephoto perspective and then isolate certain shapes or textures, and especially repetition of texture. And in this case, finding these distorted reflections out of the windows was one of the most interesting things to me. And so I kept looking at the tops of the windows to see what else I could find, and I finally stumbled upon a reflection that I thought was really cool. This photo right here was my favorite of the bunch, and I love how these distorted reflections almost make it look like a painting. Unfortunately, as sunset rolled around, I didn't really have a lot of time to shoot, and I didn't have time to vlog. But I did capture this one image of One World Trade out in the distance, and then I decided to save my energy for some nighttime shooting.
All right, so we're out here at night after sunset, and I think I'm gonna try and do a time-lapse clip of all of the New York City traffic. So I've got the Sony A1 right here with the 28 to 200 millimeter lens. And then in terms of my settings, I think what I'm gonna do is a nice 0.8 of a second exposure, which will give me really nice blurry car trails. ISO 100 to keep it low, nice and clean, and then f6.3. I'm a little bit underexposed for this shot because I want to protect the highlights for the time lapse. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the interval timer function, interval shooting, and then a 1 second interval. So this is what the perspective looks like at about 28 millimeters. And it's nice, but I feel like there's a little bit too much of the empty space of the road and the sky up above, which I don't really need. But watch what happens when I zoom in. So there's at about 135, and that looks pretty cool with all the traffic there. It'll be really nice to have the motion coming towards the camera and away from the camera, but then also the side-to-side action too.
So here's just a fairly simple composition of that same street, this time pulling back a bit wider and then shooting a 20-second exposure to get all of those light trails. After this, we decided to head to Grand Central Terminal, and I really wanted to get this straight-on time-lapse of the Pershing Square restaurant. I pretty much stuck to the same settings that I used in the previous time-lapse, and here's how it turned out. Now, I'm no street photographer, but I kind of liked the way this still frame turned out with that long exposure streak going through the scene, and the positioning of all the people on their phones. It almost looks like it could be some kind of album cover.
So it's a rainy day here in New York City, and I'm trying more architectural photography, some abstract stuff as well. Still have the 28-200 on here, and check this out. So this is at the widest ends, about 28 millimeters. Really cool though, love the architecture. But if I zoom in here, I can start to kind of isolate the building and some of the shapes here. I love the lights. Even if we just cover the entire frame with the building, and then we could also aim up at the top of the building here, and every once in a while it gets kind of covered by the clouds, which is really cool. So in terms of my settings here, I'm still using a slightly higher ISO at 500, and then I'm doing, f8 to f11 to give myself a nice sharp frame, make sure most things are in focus, even though what I'm shooting out there is at infinity. For my shutter speed, I'm just making sure to double whatever the focal length is. So with this lens at 200 millimeters, I can do 1/400th of a second and know that my shot is going to be perfectly tack sharp. What's really cool is the lighting keeps changing. Some of these dark clouds keep appearing behind the building, which makes the building stand out even more. So I'm going to try a few different variations here, some closer, some a little further away, and see how this turns out.
Right next door was the Oculus, which is one of my favorite buildings in New York City. I decided to go for a minimalist look of the architecture, and here's what I shot. I really love the simplicity here, and I went with a high-key processing style to give this one a dreamy, ethereal look.
Got my buddy Jude right here, shooting some cool shots.
We out here?
You getting good stuff?
Oh yeah, I think so. I might have to have you critique it, so.
So here is the One World Trade Memorial. There's the buildings up there, cool reflections. Tried to get a couple reflection shots just like up in the building in there. And yeah, there's some really nice textures here with the rain spots. So I was thinking about maybe getting a shot like that. Kind of tough, but we'll see how it turns out.
So this was kind of a fun abstract shot to take, and what I thought was really cool about this image is how you can kind of make out the shadow of the building in the background of all of those rain spots. And you can see the reflection of the buildings in the droplets as well. It would have been kind of cool to have a macro lens with me and shoot this even tighter, but I felt like given the spontaneity of the shoot, the 28-200 did a really good job here.
All right, we are about to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yo.
See if we can get some good abstract shots or kind of moody rain shots, maybe wide angle or something like that.
This photo right here ended up being one of my favorites from the walk, and I love how you just get a peek of One World Trade appearing out of the fog. Photographing New York City is so much fun because it feels like a giant scavenger hunt. There's interesting textures and patterns at every corner, and you just have to be willing to find them. Unfortunately, while we were walking on the bridge, it started pouring rain, so we decided to cruise on back and find an area that was less in the open. I gotta be honest, I was not prepared for how much rain there would be on this trip, and I was absolutely soaked while trying to shoot New York at night. But it was worth it for all of the beautiful reflections on the ground and the incredible atmosphere up above. So we visited a few familiar spots, and then I went to a place that I've always wanted to visit, the Manhattan Bridge. I loved the emotion that came through in this image with all of the textures, reflections, and that mist in the background. Initially, I wanted to try a long exposure here, but I decided to go with a short shutter speed so that I could freeze the taxis and get the steam coming off the building on the right side. The next day, I visited Golden Gate Park in the rain, and I found a couple groves of fall color to photograph. Now, these images weren't anything crazy, but they did give me a really interesting idea. Up until now, I'd been so focused on just architecture, but what if I mixed elements of woodland photography as well? And so after searching around for a little while, here's what I came up with. These shots were so fun to take and really combined all the elements that I love about photography. Mixing genres and styles, these definitely took me out of my comfort zone and were a real challenge to take. And I think the biggest part of that was just mixing all of the organic shapes of the branches and then the geometric shapes of the windows in the background. After this, I did decide to revisit the Manhattan Bridge to see if I could get a perspective of it with Freedom Tower in the background. And it was really interesting seeing the differences between shooting it on a clear evening and the rainy night that I had before. Every time I visit a city like New York, I always try and find high-up perspectives, and it was the one thing that was missing from this trip so far. But luckily I finally found one, and it was absolutely incredible. I decided to set up a time-lapse of the Brooklyn Bridge down below, but unfortunately the glass was pretty high up, so I had to use my lens skirt to get out all the reflections. After letting the camera sit for about 15 minutes, here's how it turned out. The next day would be my last outing in New York City, and I never feel like a trip is complete without visiting the New Jersey side to look at the skyline out in the distance. I decided to shoot a quick time-lapse sequence of the skyline and then focused on stills afterwards. So here's just a very simple still photograph, single exposure, and a short shutter speed. I really liked that giant cloud up top, but then I decided to throw on a 10-stop filter, and then I shot this. So blurring out the texture of the clouds and the water down below gave this a completely different look and made it really surreal. But now I'd love to hear from you. Which one of these images do you prefer more? Do you like the more realistic look to the scene with that cloud up above? Or do you enjoy the more simple minimalist look to the scene? Please let me know in the comments. So as mentioned before, I was out there for a Sony event, and I want to thank them so much for bringing me out there. It was for the launch of their Sony a1 II, which is a fantastic camera. But more importantly than that, I got to connect with a ton of like-minded photographers and filmmakers, and it really just got me inspired to get out there and shoot more. This trip to New York City was a lot of fun. I felt like I shot a ton of stuff, and I think the biggest part about this trip was really challenging my creativity and getting out of my comfort zone, which is something you should always do as a photographer, especially when you're starting to feel a bit complacent with some of the work that you're doing. So throw yourself a curveball every once in a while and shoot something completely different. With that, I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more. And yeah, I'll catch you in the next one.